So what is a frontier is our topic for today. We will go through We will go through today's talk in 4 parts. So the first part is a general introduction to the topic. We'll then do a very focused case study of Roman Britain, which is directly relevant to the WallCAP project. We'll then look at some secondary case studies, which include Imperial China and 18th century North America as other frontiers. And then we'll pull it all together in a conclusion section. So starting with part 1, an introduction. So the first thing I'd like to ask is for you to really think about how you would define a frontier. So what I would say is think of an example. When you think of a frontier, what is the example that comes to mind right away? Once you have that example, what are the key factors, the key traits or attributes that tell you or affirm to you that that example you have in your head is a frontier? So what about that is frontiery? And then if you were asked to, in your own words, how would you define or explain the concept of frontier? So imagine you're having to explain it to a child or to someone who's learning the English language or a newly landed alien from outer space. How would you explain that concept? Now, the reason I'm asking you to do that is because for us to have any sort of kind of meaningful discussion about what a frontier is, you have to have a reasonable consciousness and awareness of what you think a frontier is compared to what I'm going to argue a frontier is for the rest of this talk. So I hope you've all had an example. I hope you can think about what makes a frontier, and we'll come back to that at the end in discussion. Now, the term frontier is originally borrowed from French in the 15th century. That's when we first see frontier in English. And it's referring at that time primarily to a militarized front line or forward zone. So it's very focused toward military action. And if you think about England's wars on the continent at that time, particularly with the French, you can see how that usage would come about. Subsequently, over the following centuries, frontier has expanded beyond the military sphere, and we'll refer more generally to kind of border zones or border lines, peripheral regions and territories, but also it's grown into a metaphorical concept for kind of cutting edge or beyond the known. So if you think to Star Trek, the final frontier, as it were, it's that into the unknown. The thing is, you have to be aware of using frontier in a flippant manner, because there's a really complex lexicon, a terminology or vocabulary that relates to boundaries and peripheries. And so the words that we use have implications. I think we can all agree on that, given the insurrection in the US last week. We need to think about the words we use and make sure we're using the correct words to communicate the right concept or action. So there are 2 kind of simple binary usages of frontier in English language. So there's a more British and European default concept, which is most clearly articulated by Lord Curzon, the former Viceroy of India. And he's often discussing or talking about frontiers in relation to his experience of the northwest frontier of India. And he usually is using the term frontier to refer to something linear, very much a border, that line of the border and the surrounding lands, which you could call borderlands. In this aspect of the concept, it's really very strongly rooted in the imperialist experience of 19th century Britain and other European powers. And one of the things which is quite interesting is that when you look at European scholarship or imperial administrators, whether they're British or French or German, Dutch, when they're writing about frontiers, they're making territorial claims, but it's also often written in opposition to other European powers. So it's a very kind of Eurocentric conception of space and territory. In contrast, when we look at the American experience, the default concept there is a bit different. And this is articulated most clearly by Frederick Jackson Turner, who's known as the father of the frontier thesis, in which he argues that the frontier is a vast territory encompassing lands that stretch quite distantly to either side of very frequently shifting borders. Frontiers are dynamic, porous, transitional, and the key thing is that he's saying a frontier connects civilization to wilderness. He further goes on to argue that the frontier is fundamental to the shaping of American character, which promotes Americans as independent, rugged, go-get-'em attitude sort of people. He doesn't really talk about some of the negative aspects of Americans that much. But this concept of frontier is very much rooted in that American colonial and imperial experience, in which it's not a small country bound by a bunch of other small countries as you get in Europe. It's actually quite a large country with a lot more space that can move into, or I should say take over. So if we think of the Curzon view is kind of articulating the European perspective, and the Turner view is articulating the more colonial American and to some extent Canadian and Australian perspectives, but also it fits in nicely with other big country views like Russia or Brazil. Both those concepts are slightly different. One is more linear and very boundary focused. The other is much more regional and vast territory in focus, but they're also both very culturally biased. You could even argue racist views, because they almost always exclude indigenous cultures and other political organizations or societies that aren't of, say, European or Western in their organization. Now that's changed since the 19th century. That thankfully we have much more inclusive scholarship. We take account of the influences and impacts that various cultures have on each other. But I think the important thing is to note that those views, those definitions of frontier, are very much the products of the cultural geography and politics of the era in which Curzon and Turner lived. And so we have to kind of explicitly acknowledge that. And that's going to shape how we ourselves first encountered and learned about frontiers. So it's important that we can admit that and acknowledge that right up front. Now, if we think about those two views, there are implications with that. So if we equate frontiers with a line or a boundary or a border, what are those implications? Well, for one thing, it makes people start linking frontiers with natural, so-called natural boundaries, rivers, mountain chains, those sort of topographic features, which often conveniently form boundaries. Equating frontiers with lines also tends to utilize what you could call a modern conception of clearly defined space, lines on maps. And that's not exclusively Western. Various other ancient civilizations and near ancient civilizations did it, like Imperial China, in terms of drawing lines on maps. But it very much focuses on that line on map mentality and how that defines space. The other thing that is problematic with equating frontiers with kind of lines and boundaries is it often implicitly, subconsciously will impose more modern notions of border controls and activities. In which case, is it really appropriate to be thinking of Hadrian's Wall in the same way that you would a modern border checkpoint? Looking at the other angle, the more Turnerian view of equating a frontier with a region or a zone, that has implications that swing the other direction. So if you're looking at a broader region, frontiers then will have an association to a physical environment, particularly a particular type of topography, like a mountainous region, or if you think of the northern frontier zone around Britain as an upland region, or a particular ecology, say the pre-desert, for example, in North Africa. And by doing that, you then tend to kind of obfuscate or make fuzzy what can sometimes seem quite starkly defined spaces on the ground. So by encompassing everything in a region, you sometimes lose the granularity, the resolution of a focus on the ground that you would get with, say, a border. Also, the sort of regional emphasis on a frontier tends to de-emphasize political factors and will instead often focus on social and cultural practices, which means that those frontiers can be detached from politics. Sometimes that's helpful, but that's not always the case. And then, as I said before, we have a really complex vocabulary in English to choose from when we talk about frontiers and related issues. So when we do talk about frontiers, what words are we using? Are we using words like boundary or border? Are we using words like fence, barrier, wall? Are we talking about the periphery or peripheral aspects? Are we talking about the liminal or delimiting space? Are we talking about the transitional? So there's all these kind of other associated words that get brought into the notion of frontier. And those are the things that we need to bear in mind, because those other words further shape how we communicate a concept and how it's understood. So I hope that all makes sense. From that kind of general, we'll move on now to look at Roman Britain as a case study. So when it comes to identifying Roman frontiers, we're quite fortunate in the sense that first, the territorial extent of the Roman Empire can be really easily identified from archaeological evidence in many different forms. There's distinct material culture that says the Romans were here. And so that really helps us, as I say, define a territorial entity of the Roman Empire. More importantly, though, when it comes to frontiers, is we have a very consistent form of evidence in the peripheral territories of the Roman Empire, and that's the remains of military installations. So legionary fortresses, the smaller forts of auxiliary regiments, towers, fortlets. There's a whole range of things there that are immediately recognizable as belonging or having been built by the Roman army. And therefore, this means that Roman frontiers can be identified through archaeological means. That means essentially that we can take those material remains and associate them with the frontiers, with the peripheries of the Roman Empire. And that's because those installations are very distinct, very easily identifiable structures with archaeological footprints that can be seen in aerial photographs and satellite imagery, lumps and bumps on the ground, the topographic remains. Even if they can't see them on the ground, we've got geophysical survey, which will reveal their shape, and then ultimately excavation. So there's many different ways of identifying those types of sites. In addition, there's things like inscriptions, military equipment, particular types of buildings, even within those installations, like granaries, that all point to a strong Roman military culture, material culture. So the point I'm trying to make here is that actually just through archaeology alone, even if we had no textual evidence, we could say something about the Roman Empire as a territory and the edges of its territory and its army. And the correlation between the Roman army and the edge of empire, what we call the frontiers, is very strong and clear. So this means we can do an archaeological case study. So if we start with the earliest phase of Roman influence and occupation of Britain, really, there are 6 phases, and we'll just kind of go through those to try and pick out the key aspects. In phase A, the earliest phase of the Claudio-Neronian period from AD 43 to 68, what you're seeing in the shaded purple area is that initial conquest of Britain and the initial start of consolidation of occupation, ownership, government of the island, including the establishment of colonies where Roman citizens were settled to live and breed more Roman citizens. Okay, that's very much focused essentially in the south of England and the Midlands. When we move on to the next phase, we see that military conquest has moved further west and further north in the Flavian period, so between AD 69 and 96. This is really the most extensive period of conquest in terms of military distribution in Britain. So you can see that purple shaded area is showing the distribution of all the military sites. Now, not all of those sites are contemporary, by which I mean they're not all occupied at the same time, but for a phase that shows you just how widespread the Roman army was in Britain at that time. What's more important here is that bit of white in the south and east of England. East Anglia, the Southeast Midlands, and the Southeast, that's where a more normal consolidation of provincial territory has been begun by the Romans. That's to say that there are civitates, the local, I suppose you could think of them as county seats, but the local government seats, which collect tax and start running the countryside as a normal province. So it's not necessarily managed or run by the army in the same way that the purple shaded area is. In the next phase, under Trajan and Hadrian, so between AD 97 and 137, we're seeing much more of a shrinkage or more concentrated area of military strength. So the Southwest has been quote unquote pacified and brought into provincial territory and organization. Much of the presence in Scotland has been withdrawn, and that's partly for political reasons. Certainly Trajan was quite busy in Dacia and needed a lot of that manpower of the Roman army to deal with the Dacians. So there were practical considerations elsewhere in the empire that impacted on the military situation in Britain. And you can see there's a bit more of a forward focus, I suppose you could call it, where Hadrian's Wall is built under Hadrian. And prior to that, you've got the Staingate line of forts, that cordon being established and strengthened under Trajan. But the key thing here is a reduction in the military zone, the purple, and an expansion of the civilian zone, the white, through the south, most of the south of England. In the next phase, under Antoninus Pius, so between AD 141 and 158, you have a northward push in terms of military occupation. Now, it's not to say there aren't any military bases further south in Wales and northern England. They're still there, but the main focus of military presence is very much northern England and southern Scotland. Again, that is accompanied by further provincial expansion into Wales, across the whole Midlands, and even into Yorkshire, which could be seen as the southern bit of the north, but materially is actually much more like a Midlands county than a northern county in some cases. In the next phase, then, actually we see a pullback in the basically the later 2nd through the 3rd century. The Roman army is pulling back. That forward focus is again kind of along the line of Hadrian's Wall, but there are outpost forts that are occupied to the north. Wales has, again, more intensive, slightly more intensive military occupation. And then there's this establishment along the south and east coast of England of what's known as the Saxon Shore. So actually you're getting another expansion of military territory at the expense of provincial territory. And that situation holds true through the 4th century and into the early 5th century, which is when Roman Britain is lost. One of the things that's notable in terms of the military territories is an expansion of more coastal installations. You see that in Wales, in the Yorkshire coast, the western coast of Cumberland, Westmoreland. So while there's still more kind of coastal military installations being built, they retain that forward focus of Hadrian's Wall. That's not given up either. And of course, the Saxon Shore is also retained in the south and east. So the military orientation has shifted in the 3rd and 4th centuries. But you still get this, I suppose you could say, simplistic dichotomy between military occupied territory and non-occupied territory, more civilian territory. What that means is when we talk about something like the northern frontier of Britannia, throughout basically from AD 96 up to the end of the Roman period in the early 5th century, is that purple shaded area is the frontier. It's shifting back and forth. While there is a focus, as it were, a linear focus along Hadrian's Wall, those military garrisons, the forts, the bases, were sometimes to the north of the wall. They sometimes pulled back to the south of the wall. But all of the north of England had military forts in it. You just seem to get a more denser concentration of military garrisons in, say, the 30 miles to the north and south of Hadrian's Wall and along the wall. So it's important that we establish that military presence is not just a simple line. It's actually much deeper territory. Now, if we think about that Roman organization space through the Roman army, how that's defining a frontier, how does that compare to the pre-Roman situation, the post-Roman situation? Well, with the pre-Roman situation, we think we know where the various kind of groups, societies that we often refer to as tribes existed, but we know that through Roman sources. So it's slightly problematic. We have to take that information with a grain of salt. So the map here is showing the different tribes that we think we know where that kind of area they lived, but we can't always be sure. And then there are questions around things like the textiverity. Are they a local tribe, social group, or are they perhaps an imported tribal group? There are some claims that they're Germanic. There are others that claim they're British. Same thing, the Chorea Notate. They're only attested on a single inscription is a band of raiders who were defeated, which has now been lost. It was found in Hexham Abbey. They're the only attestation we have of them. Should they be associated with the kind of Hexham Corbridge area on similarity of place names? There's lots of things here we don't know, but the key thing is that Hadrian's Wall, the Stane Gate, doesn't correspond in any way to any of our knowledge of any Iron Age boundaries between different social groups. When we look at post-Roman Britain, the immediate kind of post-Roman aftermath, there's a number of various smaller kingdoms that emerged in the 5th and 6th centuries. Northumberland is thought to be part of the kingdom called Bernicia, from the Brythonic Brunic. Reged, we think, is somewhere around the Solway, but we don't know specifically where, and even that's a bit questionable. We're fairly confident the kind of East Yorkshire and parts of the North Riding are part of the kingdom of Deira. Around the Leeds area, we know there's Elmet. Godalming is the kingdom which is kind of now the Lothians. Alclud at Dumbarton, around kind of the Glasgow area. There's all these kind of place names and things we have. They eventually are kind of conquered and brought into the kingdom of Northumbria, which spans most of the map that you can see on your screen. So again, there's not boundaries here that correspond to Hadrian's Wall or Roman territories of space. And then if we fast forward even further, if we look at the Anglo-Scottish border marches, you can see in purple, the purple line on that map is the border between England and Scotland. As I'm sure you all have clearly spotted, it is not the same line as Hadrian's Wall. So again, we have different conceptions of space under different political regimes. Okay, so it's not perceived as the same. So what does this tell us then? What can we conclude from that brief kind of 6 phases of Roman military occupation of Britain and looking at the pre and post-Roman scenario on the ground? Well, I would say there are 5 conclusions that we can draw. One is that the frontier is defined and distinguished from a more normal provincial territory through military occupation. And basically that frontier is then separating the Roman provinces from what the Romans called Barbaricum, basically the land of the barbarians. And it's a very general, vague term. It's not necessarily a slur so much as just not Roman or uncivilized. Furthermore, the frontier is always a broad zone of military occupation, varying in size at any time. And its size is very much related to kind of processes of conquest and consolidation and withdrawal. Thirdly, the construction of monumental complexes like Hadrian's Wall or the Antonine Wall may have created, quite literally, a hard border, but they never replaced that larger frontier zone of military occupation. Both of those walls also demonstrate that the borders don't need to conform to the physical geography of the landscape. So for Hadrian's Wall, the windsill is very convenient, but actually there's a lot of places where it would have made more sense to build Hadrian's Wall east and west of the windsill, but they didn't. Or the same thing with the Antonine Wall. They're not always following the best topography for building an impressive wall. They're using other rules to factor into the decision-making. The fourth conclusion is that the Roman frontier didn't oppose or face a large centralized neighbor. So those barbarian societies were much smaller socio-political groups. And if you compare them to the entirety of the Roman Empire, they're exponentially smaller. So that asymmetry between the Roman Empire and barbarian groupings is quite important. And the fifth and final conclusion is that frontier is established and subsequently dissolved very relative to the political reality of the Roman Empire. And so the fact that it's a military occupation, it's got a military character, and it's dynamic relative to military circumstances as well as politics, is fundamental to Roman civilization, politics, and culture. So if we bear those in mind, what does that mean when we look at Britain compared to other Roman frontiers? So those sort of conclusions, those 5 conclusions that I just outlined, they can really apply to every other frontier sector of the Roman Empire. And however many frontiers you want to claim, this map is just kind of vaguely categorizing them in the Trajanite, in the Antonine period, Trajanite to Antonine period, they change over time. Those rules apply to all the frontiers with one exception, and that is the little blue rectangle over here in the east, in the part of the Roman Empire that lines up with the Persian Empire. And that's because it's a bit different. It doesn't seem to be a frontier like all the other frontiers of the Roman Empire. For one thing, the Persian Empire is equal in size and wealth and power to the Roman Empire. The Romans might not want to have called them equal, but they certainly distinguish them as something different. We know historically that anytime the Persians rose up as a potential threat to the empire, they were always prioritized over any other barbarian groups or threats elsewhere in the empire. And when we look at the kind of style of warfare, and which often focused on invasion, conquering cities, or besieging a city, or holding out from a siege, and then the treaties afterwards, they're all focused on occupation of key cities. And there's a much more boundary conception. Certain cities in the territory belong to the Romans or the Persians, and that establishes actually clear lines on the ground, as it were, clear maps. So with Persia, actually, the Romans don't have a frontier. They have a borderland, a border scenario. And actually it's quite stark in how different that is compared to the other peripheral zones, which we would call frontiers. So even in the Roman Empire, there are exceptions. Now, what do those observations mean if we look at other frontiers? So very quickly, if we look at Imperial China and then North America in the 18th century and see what we can further draw from that. So why do we compare? Well, Imperial China is a really interesting comparison because it basically is coalescing as an empire at the same time that the later Roman Republic is moving toward an empire, those 2 centuries BC, last 2 centuries BC. Again, like the Roman Empire, it's highly militaristic and controls, vast continuous swathes of territory, all of which were ruled through really complex government bureaucracy centered on cities and primarily taxed agricultural produce and surplus. So those kind of basic points are quite similar to the Roman Empire, even if the culture, language, there are other things that are quite different. With the colonial experience of 18th century North America, that's much more different from Rome and Imperial China, in that you have 4 competing European imperial powers at the start of the 18th century. And by the end of the 18th century, there's only 2, one of those being new. And through most of that century, those imperial centers were completely separated from those colonial interests and frontiers. They were across the Atlantic Ocean in Europe. There's much different environmental constraints and impacts, and there was a lot less infrastructure in those North American colonies than you would find in the European heartlands. So actually that's quite a stark difference from, say, Rome and China. So the thinking here is if those observations for Roman Britain hold true in China and North America, then we might be onto something in terms of finding more universal definition of a conception of frontier. So with Imperial China, typically the focus is on the Great Wall. But one of the things we need to think about with the Great Wall is it's around for about 2,000 years, from the 2nd century BC up to the 17th century AD. And depending on how you want to define and count your dynasties, there's at least 9 different dynasties that are, ruling China with the Great Wall, Imperial China with the Great Wall. So in terms of a monumental wall, not only its size, we're looking at over 25,000 kilometers by some measurements, is much grander than, say, Hadrian's Wall, but also chronologically, it's much longer lived as a linear monument. But also, is it just a wall? Is the frontier just the wall, or is there more? The Great Wall itself is a rather complicated beast. The earliest lengths of it predate Imperial China. So on the map that's to the right of the screen, the yellow lines are sections of wall built during the Warring States period, which is kind of right before China unites into an empire. Once China becomes coalesced into an empire, each kind of dynasty adapted or abandoned the Great Wall or built new lengths of it. basically as it was required time for the politics. And so that map on the right is really useful because all those different colored lines it kind of show you where stretches of Great Wall were built relative to particular dynasties. And there's that timeline at the bottom of the map, which can kind of help you color code and separate that out by time and space. Where we're quite fortunate with Imperial China is there's fantastic surviving documentary evidence in terms of both text and actually maps that show how there were quite discrete sectors of the Great Wall that were intended to operate as military districts and zones with military and civilian officials near to the wall and actually quite distant from it. So again, like Hadrian's Wall, you can say that the Great Wall is a monumental focus, but also it's not the entire military district. It's not limited to the line of the wall. The military district is actually stretching further outward from the wall and further back from the wall. And a key concept here, or terminology here, that an American scholar, Owen Lattimore, in the 1920s, I think, he kind of looked at that Imperial Chinese thinking of space and frontiers and referred to an inner frontier and an outer frontier, which were almost established by the line of the Great Wall itself, the inner frontier being south of the Great Wall or inside the Great Wall, in China, as it were, and outer frontiers were the bits that were north of the Great Wall or outside of China. And he further linked this transition from inner frontier to outer frontier, and the location and presence of the Great Wall is relative to the ecological transition of the environment, where the land and settlement moved from permanent agricultural settlement to semi-agriculturist to purely nomadic lifestyles, with the frontiers occupying that semi-agricultural settlement. And we'll come back to that inner and outer frontier aspect later. The other element is when we look at the Great Wall and the broader, deeper frontier districts associated with it, is what Great Wall and when are we talking about? Just from these pictures alone, you can see that there are different types of construction of the Great Wall of China. So mud brick with some hay and thatch, stone, brick, and they're often, in quite diverse landscapes as well. So, to think of it as one unifying monument is problematic in and of itself, because actually it's quite, despite the fact that it does seem to be one unifying monument, it isn't. Hopefully, as that last map showed you with the different colors. And so in this case, we can think of the Great Wall in much the same way we can with Hadrian's Wall as a great distraction. In Chinese history, the Great Wall occupies a central imperial initiative, and it brings security to all of imperial China. And it's effective. It blocks small nomadic steppe armies. The chaps that are shown shooting arrows from horseback in the images to the right. That said, small raiding parties could scale or take over a gate, a pass, and therefore breach the wall, which was fairly common. And then, depending on exactly what time in history, usually, every 100 years to, at most 300 years, there would be some substantial alliance of those nomadic steppe people led by a very charismatic and effective warlord who would provide a really substantial threat. And then it didn't matter that there was a Great Wall there. It would be breached just by sheer numbers and volume of the enemy. So in terms of its effectiveness, it works, but only at a certain scale of opposition. To this day, the Great Wall occupies a very symbolic role of the security of China, and is also associated with civilization, in the sense that, how far the Chinese took their civilization. Yet there's a contradiction here, because many of those Chinese dynasties, those 9 or more dynasties that I pointed out earlier, whenever they fell or collapsed, often it was related to their ineffectiveness to deal with various frontier issues, whether it was trade or warfare, or even internal rebellion. And typically, the next dynasty often emerged or originated or sprung from the elite frontier families of imperial China. And so you get this interesting recurring pattern throughout imperial Chinese history of a dynasty establishes itself. They kind of stop being able to effectively cope with issues. and collapse. And then a new frontier dynasty emerges, takes over all of China, and the cycle repeats itself. So the role of the frontier in China is quite important. And it's not just the Great Wall, it can be the Western frontiers or even the Southern frontiers, where China is butting up against various subcontinental Indian cultures. But that frontier aspect of culture is really important. And I would point to, as a final example here, the story of Mulan, which has been Disneyfied in animation and recently in live action. The story of Mulan that we have is not, I'm sure you'll be surprised, is not quite like the Disney movie, but Mulan is emerging as a figure in, say, the 5th or 6th centuries AD, in the West, what we'd call late antiquity. And she is from an aristocratic frontier family. And so the context of that story is that Mulan isn't quite what we would call a standard imperial elite Chinese member society. She's from a much more mixed family. And the medieval poems that tell the tale show how it's actually she and her family are in a much more hybrid position. So moving on from China, if we go to 18th century North America, so quite a vast difference in time and space. The map on the left is showing you basically the different colonial interests in North America, with the orange being the Spanish in Florida and what's now Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona, into some of those other states as well. You can see in the blue that the French actually had quite a bit of extensive territory. And then the British is in the kind of salmon color. And then the stripy salmon blue is French territory given to Britain in the early 18th century. What's not shown, because it was in like 1703, is the bits that belonged to the Dutch. So New York in particular, that were granted to Britain through a treaty arising from other European wars. So at the start of the 18th century, you've got the Dutch, the Spanish, the French, and the British, all with colonial possessions in North America, holding different swathes in territory, and each pursuing different policies and practices in terms of what they do in those colonies. The map on the right, I think, is worth showing because the darker shaded gray, and I apologize for the poor quality of the map. I scanned it out of a book, so some of it's not great quality, but the shaded gray, darker gray areas in the map shows you just how little European settlement there was in the eastern half of the United States and in lower Canada. And actually what you see, all those names are the names of various native peoples. And actually that sort of map is exactly the sort of thing when we look at maps of Roman frontiers with shading for the Roman army or Roman settlement and all these floating names for different barbarian peoples. So the thing to point out here is actually that conception of space that our society is putting onto past societies is replicated despite specialisms. Now, if we think about warfare in the colonies, there are what you would call hard points in which the European colonial powers are building forts, armories, and blockhouses, but these are always built at key locations to control the landscape. Passes at the heads or mouths of rivers, important strategic points and locations. They tend to be built in timber or stone, but the main thing is that they're building these fortifications for European style warfare. So the two examples I've given you, on the right, you've got Fort Ticonderoga, which is originally called Fort Carillon, built by the French on Lake Champlain. And in the lower left, you've got Fort Stanwix, which is built in timber. But you can see from the style fortifications, they're built to house artillery and to take artillery fire. That those kind of triangular star formations are all about artillery, effectively, cannon shot, and launching cannon shot and taking cannon shot. So the fortifications they're building are not for warfare with the natives, they're for warfare with other European powers. And what's really important to note is that those forts were often lost or captured, not because of traditional European warfare, but because of the local frontier style of warfare. That's to say, people were quite easily, under the cover of darkness, able to run up to the stockade and barricades, climb the walls, and get inside and either kill everyone while they sleep or scare the crap out of them and take over the fort. but the two styles of warfare weren't necessarily compatible. And that guerrilla style warfare of the frontier was pervasive. So it was something that the colonists learned. And then the various European influences that were brought in, so guns, for example, were also adapted by natives. And so it's not a native style of warfare, and it's not a European style of warfare. It's very much a colonial frontier style of warfare, which is taking influence from both European and native cultures. And the expansion of those imperial powers of colonial settlement wasn't due to military conquest. The biggest factor was the growing European population and the way that territorial extent spread through religious proselytization, conversion, various economic exchanges, and all sorts of social exchanges, including diseases. So often, European diseases were doing the work of European armies in advance of any populations. And there's lots of good documentation around this. But what that's showing is the limits of those kind of European colonial powers, what they could effectively do, and what was happening as a consequence of their presence. So in the final bit, if we bring this all back together with some conclusions, key question is, what aspects are shared across all those frontiers in the 3 case studies? So one, I would argue, is that we can see the frontier societies as something different from the normal society of that particular society. So whether that's Roman provincial culture or a Chinese urban civilization or Europe in the 18th century, and also different from local indigenous society. The other thing to point out is that there might be linear features like rivers or mountains that could provide a convenient geographical demarcation or focus, but they were never themselves the frontier. Okay, and what this means is that frontiers are not borders. You should not equate them. The third thing is that the frontier was defined by the politics and culture of the imperial societies, whether that's Rome, China, or European. And those frontiers weren't defined by the local indigenous peoples. They didn't say, oh, we're going to have you build a wall here or put the fort here. They didn't get that part, that decision-making part. Also, with all the examples we've given, there's no indigenous society of comparable size or wealth or resources to those imperial societies. The one exception that I pointed out was Persia, which was roughly equal to Rome. So in all those other cases, what we're seeing is massive asymmetry between an imperial society and those indigenous societies. Because of these factors, then, we can see frontiers as being quite dynamic spaces in which the territorial extent is often shifting, but also dynamic culturally, because there's all those different cultures coming into play in contact with each other. But the reason they exist is because there's some imperial society, European, Chinese, Roman, which is establishing it. So if we focus on that asymmetry, I've tried to kind of create a visual to communicate that. So think of that square as your kind of powerful state, your imperial society, whether that's Roman, China, European. And basically they're coming into contact with much smaller societies. Tribes are often what we tend to use in more everyday speech, but actually that's not a favorable term in scholarship anymore. We tend to say fragmented societies, and that also is problematic, but that's where we are at the moment. So if you think of that central powerful state, that big square coming into contact with lots of smaller societies, you can see, if you think of it in terms of direct one-to-one relations between the big square and a small circle, obviously that small circle is quite small indeed relative to what the big square can bear. So if we think of that powerful state as the parent polity, and that is creating the frontier. And what this means, if a frontier is created by a powerful state, by a parent polity, then there's an orientation. There's an inside and an outside. So if you can not get sick at the lurid colors here, this is me trying to have some fun with PowerPoint, that depth that we get with a frontier, that orientation, allows us to kind of move from, say, the inside of a political parent, say, let's talk about the Roman Empire, the normal territory, the Roman province, to the inner frontier with the Romans, that area of military occupation. There might then be a border, like a river or maybe a wall. And then across that, you've got the outer frontier. Okay, there might still be some Roman military presence or some kind of friendly barbarians or whatever. And then as you get further out, you're into kind of free barbaricum, as it were. So there's that orientation. Also, the asymmetry of that larger, more powerful parent society that creates the frontier has an impact on the influence of how goods, people, and ideas move into and out of a frontier. So with something like an empire, there might be much more complex economic and productive capacity. So those finished goods are being exported in larger numbers out of the frontier than, say, finished goods would be imported from those barbarian groups. And in the European colonies, in the early modern period, this is known as mercantilism. There's actually a name for this process in which the finished goods of the parent country are sent outward to the colonies to make the colonies pay for them. At the same time, those colonies are sending back raw materials for production. And actually, that's what the Roman Empire is doing as well. And we see that a bit in Imperial China. Then when it comes to kind of cultural elements, again, the bigger, more powerful society, whether that's ancient Rome or even contemporary America, has a much greater territorial influence than, say, whatever the local culture is. And it's not to say that those parent societies, those empires, don't take on board new bits of information, new bits of culture from outside, just that it's not on an equal footing. So this brings us to a final definition of a frontier. One is that a frontier should be seen as a geopolitical concept, requiring a politically and territorially defined parent society. And if there's no political framework to apply to a territory, then there can be no frontier. So a frontier is a geopolitical construct. Secondly, a frontier is a region or zone that can only exist in circumstances of extreme political asymmetry. Okay, so the frontier is a region at the periphery, the edges of a strong centralized political territory, like the Roman Empire, but it also overlaps with one or more societies that are considerably smaller and or weaker in terms of power and size. So it's geopolitical and requires asymmetry. Those are the two kind of overriding definitions, which leave space for a lot more variability. And so again, when I tried to come up with a visual depiction of that, if we imagine that kind of dark pentagon as being, say, your parent society, your empire, the gray is kind of that frontier area. And those dotted circles are some of those smaller societies that it's coming into contact with. Some of the societies will be quite close to the borders of the parent society, will be deeply enmeshed in frontier culture. Others will be so far distant that they're not really in direct contact. That said, some of that shading will still give you a sense of some sort of cultural influence, if not direct contact. So this leaves the question then, if it's not a frontier, then what is it? So are we looking at something like a contact zone in which you have an area or a region of different languages, religions, and social organizations that come into contact with each other? These contact zones could correlate with changes in the landscape, physical changes. So like when nomads are meeting agriculturalists, but that in itself, a contact zone and different cultural elements don't necessarily create a frontier. And you can see this in modern day Britain. There are cultural differences, regional differences in accent, between the North and the South, between Wales and the West Midlands, between Scotland and Northern England. And there will be historical reasons for that, but that doesn't mean that there's a frontier despite those cultural differences. If it's not a frontier, are you then dealing with a situation in which you have a border or borderlands in which two or more kind of political entities that are roughly equal are in contact with each other? And so again, modern Europe is a great example of this. Really clearly defined borders in which those two societies meet in those borderlands. and that those borderlands might be slightly different from the core of any given country. Are you looking at an environmentally or culturally liminal place, meaning that it's at the fringes of whatever you might consider normal? So liminal is often more popularly expressed as backwater. At the risk of being rude, say the fens of England today, is that seen as a bit liminal to modern English culture? Or are we just in some sort of peripheral location, which is at the outside of some sort of territorial entity? So you can think of peripheral as a locational description, but it's not necessarily cultural. Orkney is peripheral to most of the UK, but that's not to say it's a frontier by any means. So just because you don't have a frontier doesn't mean there aren't other appropriate words or concepts to describe a liminal or peripheral or transitional situation. So the final question then, before I stop talking, you're probably sick of hearing my voice at this point, why do we study frontiers? Why is it important to define frontiers? And then once defining them, why do we study them? What does a focus on frontiers of any given society compare to its more traditional study? And then what are those benefits of studying a society from its geographic peripheries? Are there pitfalls to that? So thank you for your attention. And now I'm looking forward to a great discussion.